Welcome to the Prepped and Polished podcast, the podcast that empowers you to take control of your education, featuring weekly interviews with influencers in the world of education, as well as tutoring tips, lessons, and updates. And now, here's your host.
Hi everyone, welcome to another tutoring tips episode of the Prepped and Polished podcast. This is Aaron of Prepped and Polished. Please be sure to check out our website, www.preppedandpolished.com. For tutoring in person or online, call us at 781-753-9951 or chat with us instantly on our website. You can also join our Prepped and Polished community on Facebook and Twitter. Just search for Prepped and Polished. If you have a question after the show, please ask us a question on the chat feature on our website. We love hearing from you. Now, let's get right into episode number 246. Which test is the better test to take? The SSAT or ISEE. When considering either taking the SSAT or ISEE, it's important to keep in mind what the student is looking to take and what school he or she is applying to. Now, if you want a more detailed breakdown of what the ISEE and SSAT are, their levels and whatnot, I would recommend checking a previous podcast that we had detailing the breakdown of each type of test. However, the question for today is, which test is better to take? Now, I'm going to give a couple of answers to this, and I will say that there is no right nor wrong answer here, but it's important to keep in mind what the student wants and what the schools are looking into. I'll use that second point to start us off. First of all, we need to understand what are the schools the student is looking into require. Do they have a preference for either the ISEE or SSAT? Depending on the grade level that the student is applying to, that might determine whether it is the ISEE or the SSAT. I would recommend that when you start this journey of taking the SSAT or ISEE, you check in to see what the schools that the student is applying to require, suggest, or prefer. That is a great starting point. Another thing to keep in mind is to determine which test is the better one to take is what is the test date timeline that the student has. For example, if you're worried about taking the test multiple times, the SSAT is a better test to take as it can be offered many times over the course of the calendar year, especially when we get into the realm of applications, which are typically due in January or February. However, if a student is really good and wants to take it only once, or a schedule only permits it once, then the ISEE, with its testing seasons, might lean more in accordance with that schedule. Another thing to keep in mind when thinking about the differences between the SSAT and ISEE is the structure and the pacing. For example, if faster pacing is an issue, we want to consider what makes the most sense for time management for each section of the test. Typically, when students have difficulty going through a large amount of questions in not that much time, we occasionally do look at the SSAT for some students as, depending on the section of the test, there is a little bit more time for questions than on the ISEE. However, if you're looking at the question amount, sometimes the amount can also be overwhelming in, for example, the reading section of the SSAT, but also the ISEE Mathematics Achievement section. So there are pros and cons to either side. Another thing to keep in mind is the guessing penalty. The SSAT has a guessing penalty of a quarter point off the raw score for every incorrect answer, which may or may not sway a student towards taking the SSAT or not, whereas the ISEE does not have a guessing penalty, which again may be more beneficial. Another point about the structure and pacing is the special content. The ISEE has, in its quantitative reasoning section, a quantitative comparisons portion, where a student has to compare column A to column B to determine which value amount is greater, if they're the same, or if there's not enough information to determine. In addition, they also have the sentence completion portion, or the word placement, in the verbal section. This is where you have contextual clues of a sentence and you're trying to place the right word in the sentence. For the SSAT, instead of sentence completion, it has an analogy section where a student has to create a relationship between word pairs and find a similar pair of relationship words in the answer choices. One final difference between the SSAT and ISEE is actually the number of answer choices given. The SSAT actually has 5 answer choices for each question, whereas the ISEE has 4. So In terms of percentage guessing, 25% versus 20%. It might be something that a student finds important. Finally, the last 2 points I would say about which test is better to take depend on a few bits of information. First of all, getting a baseline. I would recommend if a student has taken neither the SSAT nor the ISEE, that they take a baseline to see which one makes the most sense for them to take in the long run and prepare for. If we can determine this is their percentile or standardized score for the ISEE, here's their percentile for the SSAT, that might be a great way to determine which is the better test to take. And at Prepped and Polished, we do offer practice tests for both the SSAT and ISEE, currently at home, but also at our office in South Natick and in Sudbury. So I'd recommend contacting us if you want to get started with a baseline for either one of those tests. The final point that I'll make in determining which is the better test to take is to really consider the preparation time ahead as well as the individual preference. Now, preference and performance. I mentioned if a student's taking a baseline, that might be a good way to determine what the student is better at. But also, if the student is like, I prefer the ISEE, then what we're going to recommend is that the student take the ISEE if their scores coincide with that. We really do recommend considering how much time you have to prepare when taking both tests. So for example, if a student is coming to us in December, has not taken the ISEE or SSAT and wants to take it multiple times, really the only option is the SSAT, which allows multiple tests, either sometimes over the course of a month or several months, whereas the ISEE's, as I mentioned, testing season is a little bit more restrictive. To wrap up, to determine which test is better to take, the ISEE or the SSAT, again, I will refer back to what the student feels most comfortable with. At the end of the day, the student's the one taking the test, in addition to determining where he or she wants to go for school. So knowing what does the school prefer, knowing what does the student prefer, or which test does the student perform best when taking, those are going to be the major indicators to determine is the SSAT or the ISEE test the better test to take. And again, please contact us at Prepped and Polished. We'd be happy to help determine which test is better, as well as review any kind of scores or previous test results that a student has taken to determine which test is best for them. This wraps up our show, episode number 246. Which test is the better one to take, the SSAT or ISEE? Please be on the lookout for our next podcast, episode number 247. Thanks for joining us on the Prepped and Polished podcast today. Now go out there and take control of your education.
You've been listening to the Prepped and Polished podcast. For more information, check out preppedandpolished.com. Also, you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Thanks for listening. Class dismissed.